Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's video extravaganza, which is featuring probably the smallest and neatest little PA amp that I have ever laid eyes on. Take a gander at this jewel. It measures a paltry 10 inches by 9 inches. Okay, we're going to go over the outside of it, the controls, inputs and outputs, and then take a look inside, and I think you're going to be very pleasantly surprised by what you see. First off, hot rod enthusiasts are just going to love these louvers, which look exactly like the ones you see on hoods and trunks of old hot rods. Also, the stainless steel automotive style trim vertically down the center, and then look at the Art Deco dial plates here for what I assume are 2 volume controls, probably for 2 different channels. If that weren't enough, you've got this crafty looking handle on top and these really neat round vents to allow heat to escape. On the sides we have the same type of louver, and now let's turn it around and scope out the back. And notice they didn't skimp. The same louvers and stainless steel trim piece on the back of the shield. And down here we have 2 4-pin sockets. I'm assuming these are for speaker output, and then a 1/4-inch jack, and I'm not sure what that's for. I'm not going to speculate till I get inside and take a look at the circuit. And then over here on this side we've got input jacks labeled mic 1 and mic 2. Now, we might have different impedance on them. We'll have to check that inside also. But the big surprise is going to be when I pull the cover off this and we see what's waiting for us inside. Now, you're probably wondering what type of low wattage, meaningless circuit could be inhabiting this very small chassis. Okay, so let's remove the cover, and we see that we have a push-pull 6V6 circuit, which, in other words, within this small package lurks the heart of like a Fender Tweed Deluxe. Okay, 2 6V6s, plus we have octal preamp tubes here. That's going to be the rectifier, so 5Y3, but 2 octal preamp tubes. So this really, I think, is going to turn out to be a spectacular little PA amp once converted to guitar use. Okay, so if that sounds interesting, let's get started and see what we can turn this into. First off, it looks like we have a very versatile output transformer with a primary impedance ranging from 3,000 to 10,000 ohms, and a secondary with a 24-watt output power. So it looks like they sure didn't skimp. Look at the size of that. It's in the ballpark of the size of the power transformer. And you know, honestly, I find that good, stout output transformers definitely make a difference in tone. And speaking of power transformers, this looks like a perfectly good one to me. It's as big as just about any I've ever seen on a 6V6 double-ended amp. Let's see if we can identify these octal preamp tubes. First off, the metal body tube is always going to be labeled, and RCA 6SC7, and I'm going to guess the first preamp position. And then our second tube, the sockets are not labeled, and I don't really see a label on this tube, but looking at it, let's see if we can figure something out about it. Notice there are 2 very similar components inside these black towers. This is going to be a duo triode. Okay, now that's going to narrow it down a lot. We need to get out our tube handbook and check through the duo triodes that are octal based, and we'll find that there's 2 or 3 different possibilities. Okay, so let's take a look. I think we're going to find the answer in the 6 6S series here of tubes. And first off, we see the 6SC7 right here. That was our first tube, metal bodied. And we see that it is a duo triode with a single common cathode. Okay, so this one then we've got figured out. Probably one triode for each input channel. That's fairly standard. And then probably one volume control for each input channel. Now let's see if we can figure out something more about the mystery tube that was in position 2. Well, this may well be it, a 6SL7 duo triode with two separate cathodes. Now, if they're using the second triode of the 6SL7 as the phase inverter for those two 6L6 tubes, it would make sense then to have two separate cathodes. Okay, so this then would be like an independent tube with the plate driving one of the 6L6 grids and the cathode driving the other. Okay, so it may well be a 6SL7. Let's see if there's any other choices. Well, it looks like a 6SN7 would fill the bill also for exactly the same reasons. So let's add that to our list. And that's about it for the two possibilities. We see then that the 6SL7 is a high mu duo triode, which means it has a lot of gain. Now let's look down here at some of the characteristics. The plate voltage is around 250 volts. Maximum is 300 volts. Plate dissipation is only 1 watt. Now let's look over here at the 6SN7, and it's sort of another, a different ball game. 450 volts, okay, which is going to be the maximum plate voltage, and plate dissipation is going to be 5 watts for each of the triodes. Okay, so it is considerably stouter of a tube. Now, I'm really not sure how we're going to break the tie between the two, but of the two, this would probably be your choice then for a robust, higher current, higher plate dissipation tube, whereas if you're looking for gain, we would be going for the 6SL7. Why? Because the amplification factor for the SL7 is 70, whereas the amplification factor for the 6SN7 is only 20. Okay, I'm going into this because I want you all to start getting comfortable with looking at tube handbooks and figuring out different characteristics of the tubes. We've gone into detail lately on making schematics and actual wiring relate to each other. Now I just want to start indoctrinating you to the tube handbook a little more. And you couldn't ask for a nicer pair of 6V6s. Both of them are marked with the red RCA logo, and they are perfectly physically matched. I'm not sure about electronically matched. We'll surely figure out more about that as the video progresses. Okay, so it looks like we've got a really nice tube set here with 4 of the tubes from RCA and then a GE 5Y3 rectifier. You can't really ask for much better than that. Okay, let's take the bottom plate off this, flip it over, and see what the circuit looks like. You know what might be interesting, since we're really not sure whether this is a SL7 or SN7, is I have both tubes in my tube stash. Why don't we try, once we get this amp up and running properly, switch them out and see how it affects the performance of the amp. And regardless of what this tube is, we can pick the optimum tube for this second position. Also looking here at this CAN filter capacitor from Sprague, we got 30, 30, and 20, and 20 at 450. Now, it's a little hard sometimes to find those EIA dates on capacitors, but this may be back the 4th week of 1965. Okay, because up here is the part number. So if so, this thing is certainly past its due date. I can check it to see what its ESR value is, but regardless, since this amp is going to be used by a musician for performances, remember just like with that previous K amp where we erred on the side of reliability over originality, we're going to have to do the same thing with this one. But anyway, it looks like a good stout set of electrolytic capacitors for the filtering. Okay, now let's put, and we see a really neat and clean circuit, good quality capacitors. This ballast resistor here is probably the cathode biasing resistor for the two 6v6s. If you look, 350 ohms would probably be about right. The pilot light. Looks like good quality components throughout, and I bet you there's not a whole lot to do to this. It already has a 3-wire power cord, although it's very short. Might have to install a longer one. But all in all, other than creating the proper output jacks for the speakers and making sure that the impedance is correct on the input jacks, I'll bet you there's not a whole lot to do on this. I'm sorry to report. But regardless, we're sure going to do some full audio testing at the end. A couple other observations. It appears that the two speaker outputs are wired in parallel, so they are equivalent. It looks like the 1/4 inch, what I would have thought was an output jack, is running over here to one of the 6v6s, so I'm not sure what its purpose is. Also, I look here on the inputs and look at this one. It's just hardwired right to the grid of that 6SC7 first preamp tube, which we know is not the right way to do it. You really need to have some sort of a grid blocker resistor, and also it's always nice to have some sort of impedance to ground fixed and established here close to the input jack. The other jack's very similar, except it has a capacitor between it and the grid, and that's another not great way to wire. So it looks like we'll have some work to do with the inputs and probably with the outputs, and we'll also need to figure out what sort of impedance speaker this Joule is going to want to be coupled to. One more observation before we get started with the work, and that is that this 1/4 inch jack runs directly to the grid of one of the two 6v6s. Now, I can't imagine what practical use that would have, so I'm going to disconnect it from that use. And the owner said that he has a speaker cabinet with a 4-pin plug that can be used with these types of sockets. So I'm going to let them be the speaker output, but I'm also going to make this into a more standard 1/4 inch speaker output jack in case he runs into speaker cabinets that don't have this type of plug, which is like everyone I've ever seen doesn't. Okay, so this will make it more versatile as far as your speaker output capabilities. Alright, let's start off with the input circuit. We have two self-grounding jacks labeled mic 1 and mic 2. Mic 1 comes through a 0.01 microfarad cap into pin 4, which is the grid of the second triode of the 6SC7. And mic 2 comes straight in to pin 3, which is the grid of the first triode of the 6SC7. I looked in here, and sure enough, there are some impedance to ground resistors lurking down around the tube socket. So I have drawn them in here, 1 meg to ground off of pin 3, 1 meg to ground off of pin 4. So that part has been taken care of. But here's where the problem lies. Number one, let's look here at the input from mic 2, and we have this giant antenna here for noise and no grid stopper whatsoever. So two problems, and number one is I'm going to use a shielded cable from the input jack to the grid, and I'm going to install a grid stopper resistor. So our mic 2 circuit is going to go from this to this. You see the shielded cable grounded at one end, and because I was very pleased with how the grid stopper values worked on that K amp that was featured just before this one, the previous video, I'm going to go with the same grid stopper values, which are 100K and 470K. This amp is going to be used by the same harmonica player, and therefore I think it makes sense to have his input set up the same for both amps, so there are no big surprises when he unplugs from one and plugs into the other. Okay, so this then is going to be the modification to the mic 2. Alright, I'm making that shielded cable for the input from the jack to the 6SC7 grid. And as I said in an earlier video, if you're like me, I've got like 4 light years of these type of cables laying around from every electronic device I ever bought, and the cable is shielded and it makes perfect audio shielded cable. So I just stripped one end. I've got my shield here, my signal here. Now I'll cut it to length, and then at this end I'll just have the signal wire sticking out because I'm only going to ground it at one end. Now let's remove this giant antenna here and install that shielded wire running from the jack through the grid blocker resistor and then onto the grid of that triode. This is the worst possible situation. This is going to pick up all sorts of noise, and then without a grid stopper you're almost just begging for some sort of parasitic oscillation or feedback of some sort. So this is really the worst way that an input could possibly be wired. Alright, I've soldered that 100K onto my signal wire. Now I'm going to wrap this joint with a small piece of electrical tape to bring it up to the diameter of the insulation, and then I'm going to cover the whole thing down to about here, so you can see there's a resistor in there with some shrink tube. There it is, wrapped with tape. And there it is with the shrink wrap. So now it's time to install it. Okay, now we see that the signal wire is connected to that contact blade and the shield is grounded. At the other end, the tip here of the 100K resistor is coming out and is welded to the grid pin of the 6SC7. Now you may wonder why I use such small diameter shielded wire. I know there's wire that you can get shielded that's the size like of the transatlantic cable, but think about it. The reason you shield the wire is to protect it from noise and electromagnetic interference. The smaller the wire is, the less of a target it is, the less of that interference it will interact with. Okay, so we want to keep our wiring when it's carrying signal as low mass as possible, as small a target as possible for noise and EMF interference. Now let's take a look at mic 1. And the thing that's unusual in this particular input circuit is that there is a 0.1 microfarad cap in series between the input jack and the grid of the 6SC7. People wonder, why do I see this on some of these input circuits, especially on the older ones? Well, it isn't to filter out frequencies. You look at this and you think, well, gee, that'll only let the high frequencies go through and it'll block the low. No, that's not at all what it's for. What it actually is a coupling capacitor. In the old days, some of the microphones and other electronic gear might have preamps or other electronic circuits that had B+, that were working with high voltage DC. This keeps that from being injected to our grid and screwing up the bias of the grid in our preamp tube. Okay, it's really just to block high voltage DC. Well, we don't really anticipate that, do we, from a harmonica microphone or a guitar pickup? So I'm going to do away with this and simply insert a shielded cable like this one, but with a higher value grid blocker. Remember in the K amp, I used a 470K, so I'm going to do the same here. And we'll test it and see how it works, but that's what I'm going to do. That way this amp input circuit will be consistent with the K, both of which are owned by the same person. And here is the shielded cable connecting mic 1 to the grid of the first triode of the 6SC7. Small diameter wire because it's carrying almost no current. It's at very low voltage, and we want to have as small a target as possible for our random noise and EMF. Well, I tested all 4 of those electrolytic capacitors in that big silver can and found that all 4 had immeasurably high ESR values. So as predicted, all 4 of those electrolytics then will have to be replaced. I'm in the process of replacing the electrolytic capacitors, and I just couldn't help but draw your attention to the lovely pink zip cord here that's been used to wire in that can cap. Obviously it's a replacement of some sort, but it's just aesthetically so splendid. Well, all the electrolytics have been replaced, and I got to tell you, it was a challenge. I know I was all excited about how small, how compact this is, but the other side of that coin is it's the devil to work on, because look down in there, you're excavating down deep into the circuit to try to lift wires and resistors and all, and rewire all the electrolytics, and to do so I ended up having to have this kind of aerial display here, but they're all in. Here's a 30, 2 20s, and naturally I didn't have any 20s on hand, so I had to do 2 10s in parallel. So we got 30, 2 20s, and under here is our 25 at 50 volt cathode bypass cap. Then I decided to remove the 18-inch power cord, which seemed kind of silly. I also don't like that it's a flat ribbon cord, so I've got a round-bodied one to put in 6 feet long, which would be a lot more convenient. So I'm going to run it through that hole in the side of the chassis and wire that in right now. I also took the time to remove all of that hideous pink zip cord that was used by some person who must have been short on wire. This stuff looks like it's been dipped in Pepto-Bismol. But anyway, now at least we don't have the jarring visual effect of that hideous pink wire. I know you'll be as shocked as I was that the same person who used pink extension cord wire to wire in the electrolytic capacitor can managed to get the primary circuit completely screwed up. And to my horror, I noticed that the filament circuit wires are not twisted anywhere, and that they lay against the chassis and wrap around the tube sockets. In other words, every single thing you could do wrong was done. So it'll be interesting to see if this thing hums much. If it doesn't, thank God. But if it does, I guess I'll have to go in and rewire the whole filament circuit. At which point I believe I will have redone every single thing that somebody before me did, which is really sad, unless they did it for free, and even then it's pretty sad. I remember when I first flipped this over and looked inside and said, oh gee, this won't take much work. Oh, boy was I wrong. So far the input circuit has been completely rewired with shielded cables and grid stopper resistors. Some of the leads have been shortened, all new electrolytic capacitors, all of the pink wire used for the screen circuits been replaced. I've rewired the jack here, the 1/4-inch jack, to be a speaker output, and I've installed a new 3-wire power cord with a proper primary circuit wiring, and the chassis is securely grounded. So now I think it's time to flip it back over and plug in a speaker, plug it into the current limiter, and see what we get out of this jewel. If it hums, if it works, if it explodes, let's take our chances, okay? Let's see what happens. Alright, we've got it plugged into the current limiter. We've got the shop speaker plugged into the newly converted speaker output jack. Power is on, tubes are lit. I hear absolutely nothing from the shop speaker. It's dead quiet, which may or may not be a good thing. Turn the volume up to about 50%. Let's see what happens. Wow. Incredible. Mic 1 works. Now let's plug into mic 2. Okay, we're plugged into mic 2, so that'll be this volume control. We'll crank it up. Seems like a little lower gain. Well, maybe not. It works. Okay, and I don't hear much hum. I'm beginning to wonder why I've been winding filament wires all these years. This thing's dead quiet. Okay, a few more checks, especially the plate dissipation here on the 6v6s. So if they're overheating, we don't damage them. And then we might be moving on to some audio testing. These beautiful Art Deco dial plates are sort of odd in that if you look, they got 0 in the middle. These are tone control plates, not volume control plates. You know, volume's going to start with 1 there and like 18 over here, but this is like bass in this direction, treble in this direction. So I don't know if these came on it. They're pretty slick and they look like they belong here, but they don't because they're really not volume control plates at all. Alright, I have the Eurotubes probe installed here under the left-hand 6v6, checking the plate dissipation, and the plate current is certainly nothing to write home about. At 15.7, that's about half what it should be. 289, sounds like a Mustang engine. 289 plate volts, so we're looking at what, about 4.5 watts? Ugh. Okay, let's check the other tube. Okay, now the probe is located underneath the right-hand 6v6, and we see that the plate current is considerably higher, about 50% higher, 22.7 milliamps. Still a little low though, 289 plate volts. So now we're looking at about 6.7 or so watts. It's still too low. Let's check that bias resistor's value and see if maybe it's might not have gone up with age. Well, it says 350 ohms, and by George, that's about what it is, 352, which is really close. So I'm going to guess that the tubes are pretty well worn out. The cathodes are unable to release sufficient electrons to generate a normal plate current. There's a quick way to tell, is I'll just go grab a couple fresh 6v6s, plug them in here and see how they behave. Well, I put in a fresher 6v6, and as you can see, the plate current has come way up to almost a normal range. So it appears to be a tube issue rather than a circuit issue. Let's try some other tubes in here and see what we can come up with. You know, I've been giving this some thought, and I have encountered sometimes these older PA amps are simply designed to operate at lower plate voltage and plate current than we normally see in guitar amps. But what occurred to me is maybe a way to resolve this is let's put in a brand new GZ34 rectifier. Okay, now it draws less filament current, so it will not tax the power transformer. It gives a very, very slow startup, so it protects the circuit. And it's way more efficient than a 5Y3. So our plate voltage and our plate current are going to go up quite a bit, probably to reasonable levels for guitar use. So let's try the brand new GZ34 and let's see what our readings are with it. Okay, it's been on now for several seconds. You see how slow the startup is. which is really nice. It's like a built-in standby switch that actually works. Look at this. Much better. Way up here, what, 318 on our plate voltage and almost 25 on our plate current. So it looks like the GZ34 can resolve all the issues that we've seen with this rather low voltage, low current circuit. Okay, let me do some quick calculations. This is going to be close to 8 watts of plate dissipation, which is great. And I think this is going to be our salvation. Sure enough, the plate dissipation is about 7.9, which is, I think, just fine for an older circuit like this, and I think it's going to give us great tone and a great performance for guitar use. Just wanted to take a few moments out here to share this fantastic gift that Jack and I just received. It's a beautiful guitar strap which is made from some very unusual material. This is fire hose that has been dyed and then had leather pieces hand stitched to the ends, and then brass like conchos and gears and other embellishments applied to it. It was handmade by a viewer named Mark David. I will stop here on his email address and phone number if you want to call him to ask him about the prices and availability of straps like this. Here are some of his business cards, and also a really nice note that he sent us. Very nicely written and to the point, but we really want to say thanks, Mark. We can't wait to install this on our guitar and use it, and every day that we do, we'll think of you and further appreciate your great generosity. Okay, so thanks a million. Now, before we get to our final audio testing of this PA amp, let's, as promised, try substituting 6SL7s and 6SN7s in this tube position to see what sort of difference we can hear, if any. And before we get started, we have to be absolutely sure that the tube socket and tubes are wired exactly the same, 6SL7 and 6SN7, so that we can do the tube exchange without causing any harm to the circuit. And as you can see, both tubes have identical internal structure, and therefore the socket will work for either the SL or SN7. And to make one other comparison that might ring a bell with most of us that are accustomed to the 12AX series of tubes, the 6SL7 with an amplification factor of 70 is more like a 12AT7 tube. Okay, now all four of these are duo triodes with separate cathodes. The 6SN7, however, is more like a 12AU7 in that its amplification factor is only about 20. Step one, we'll unplug the RCA tube that came in this tube socket. I recall that it's unmarked so that we have no idea really what it is, but based on the fact that it appears to be a duo triode, we're going to try first off a 6SL7 in this socket. Recall also that this tube has an amplification factor of 70, so compared to the 6SN7 that we'll be trying in a few minutes, we should hear greater output power and gain using this tube. Okay, I have the 6SL7 in place. I'm plugged into mic 1, and I have set the mic 1 volume straight up, so this then will be like 5 out of 10. All right, so let's play a tune and see how it sounds. we've plugged in the 6SN7 in mic 1 input with the volume control exactly the same as it was for the 6SL7. Let's see if we hear any difference. And recall that the 6SN7 has an amplification factor of only 20, so we expect much lower gain than the 6SL7. Now just for fun, let's go back to the original tube that came in the amp and that is unmarked. We're not exactly sure what it is. And all the settings are the same, mic 1 and straight up on the volume. Let's see how it sounds compared to the known SL and SN7s. Now that you've heard two tunes with the 6SL7, two with the 6SN7, and two with that original unmarked tube that was in the amp, I thought you might get a kick out of seeing how the waveforms look in an audio editing program. Now the height or amplitude of these peaks shows the relative volume that these songs, remember the settings were the same on the amp, the recording settings were the same. The only difference is the tubes. Okay, now look here, the 6SL7 had a much higher gain, punchier output. The 6SN7 was flat and boring in my book, and the original tube was sort of in between. Now I have a feeling that the original tube was a 6SL7, but that it is about halfway worn out. So it sort of came in between here. Now, my ear told me that the 6SL7 was better, and looking here at this output, these graphs of amplitude, I've got to tell you, there's no doubt in my mind, I'm going to be using the 6SL7 in this amp. Well, now that we've decided that the 6SL7 tube is the way to go, Let's have a final audio demonstration of some fresh tunes played with the little PA amp with that tube installed. Well, I guess that about does it for this video featuring the very small and stylish PA amp. I hope you enjoyed the circuit repairs as well as the determination of which tube was proper for the circuit. I want to thank all my Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors for keeping us on the air advertising free. Should you choose to join them, I will include links in the video description to enable you to do so. Now for our second feature, this is a change of pace in which I'm going to show you and demonstrate for you something that I found in a recent garage sale, and I think once you see this you're going to be scurrying out every Saturday and Sunday to see what the garages around you may contain. Okay, so if you're curious, please stay tuned. Well, greetings and welcome to part 2 of our video series in which we will investigate the contents of this apparently military steel box. Okay, this should be a little hint here, although it's misspelled, as to the contents. This came from a local garage sale of some fellow who collected radios, and I'm almost scared to tell you how little was paid for it. I might tell you later, okay, after you've seen the contents. And now the grand unveiling. 12 different chassis punches, okay, and most of them made by a company called Greenlee and in varying sizes. Let's get them all out and organize them as to the diameter of the hole they will punch. Okay, I've got them out and organized, and they range from 5/8, 3/4, 7/8. 3 of them are 1-inch diameter, Then we have 1 1/16, 1 1/8, 1 1/4, 1 3/8, and 2 at 1 1/2. All right, I pulled out one kind of in the middle of the set here, 1 inch diameter, and taken it out of the box so we can see what it looks like. It looks sort of like a piston with a bolt passing through a great big steel, kind of a donut here. And also, nice, there are instructions showing you how to use them. Okay, so let's take a look at the instructions, and then let's punch a hole in a piece of steel. First off, let's check out the proper nomenclature. The piston-shaped part is the punch, and this part here, sort of like a piece of pipe, is the die. And then, of course, down through the center is the screw, okay, a part which you're probably all familiar with. Now, in case you're wondering what these are for, if you've ever built an amp from scratch, you know you have to either drill or punch holes in the chassis for the tube sockets. Now, in this particular case, we look here at a fairly standard type of socket we'd use like for 6V6 output tubes, and we see that the outside diameter is around 1 1/8. So this would be the punch that we'd use for this tube socket. Whereas for a puny little 12AX7 tube socket, we could get by with the 7/8 punch size, which is this one right here. So instead of using a step bit like I've been using, this is an alternative. You could probably do this in your living room while you're watching TV. You do have to have a drill, however. And I think something we should try to determine is it easier to use a step bit or to use one of these punches? And also, let's look at the end result. Okay, so let's get out a piece of metal, and what we'll have to do is drill a hole in the metal to allow that central bolt to pass through, and then we'll start to tighten it down, and you see that the teeth here on either side of the punch are going to punch right through the steel and create a hole exactly the diameter of the punch. Okay, easier said than done. Let's grab a piece of steel and see how it works. And as our test subject, I nominate this DC 100 switching power supply cover. Let's drill that pilot hole right here and then proceed to punch a 1 inch diameter hole right over here through the metal surface. Okay, I've got that cover here positioned in the drill press. I'll turn it on and drill a slightly larger than 3/8 inch hole to accommodate that bolt that passes through the middle of the punch. Then we'll separate the three pieces of our punch and lubricate the threads of the bolt. Pursuant to this directive on the instructions, do not operate dry, lubricate both the punch and the threads. Then I put the punch underneath, the die on top, run the bolt through and tighten it down until the punch is secure against the bottom of the metal, and then we will use a 7/16 inch wrench to turn this bolt head. Okay, here we go. Kind of medium resistance, not terrible. Have to crank it a little further than I expected. Getting easier. There it is. Now, how about that for a perfect hole? No burrs, nothing. Perfect. And that's the beauty of these punches, I think, is the end result is really nice and smooth. Now let's drill a similar size hole over here with a step bit and see the length of the process and what the end result, how it compares. But before we move on to the step bit, I thought I would unscrew this and see if it was difficult to get that punched out piece of metal out of the die, and it's not, it just falls out. You know, sometimes with hole cutters, especially with wood, you'll get the wood piece that you cut out stuck in here, and you need like dynamite and you know, whatever, porta-power or something to get the thing loose. But not in this case, just falls out. Okay, now let's do the step bit. Now first step, no pun intended, with a step bit is to drill a pilot hole for the bit. So I just use the same pilot hole drill that we just used to make that hole for our punch. Okay, that'll get us started. But to me, the tricky part with the step bits is not knowing where to start but where to finish. Okay, and you can get really confused when you start running these through, and you're going to end up with a hole 9 times out of 10 it's too big, and it's real hard to put metal back. Okay, so what I did is I used my caliper to determine that this diameter here is exactly 1 inch, and I marked it, okay, so that I can see when this black ring is spinning in the metal that I have reached the 1 inch plateau. You'll mount your step bit in the drill chuck and make sure that you have a hole in the piece of underlying wood that will accept the amount of bit that's going to be passing through your metal. Okay, and then we're gonna put the metal in place and start going from step to step until we get to the black ring. First, of course, I'm going to don my spectacular gloves here that were sent by a concerned viewer after seeing the wretched gloves that I normally use. Okay, thank you, viewer. My left hand thanks you too. And now let's take our metal piece and position it in the drill press. Okay, I've got it in position, and if my arm or esophagus or liver happen to block your view, I apologize. But let's start drilling, okay? There's 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, and finally the very elusive black ring. Okay, so let's see what we have here now. After I get all the shavings out, okay, we can, let me back off the, you can see you've got a hole here that is not all that clean. Bunch of metal sticking out. It'll have to be finished, whereas our hole punch hole is perfect right from the get-go. Okay, so now I'm going to take a semicircular file and clean up these rough edges. Okay, still got rough edges on the inside here, so I'll have to do that too. Okay, now this part's going to be a little hard to show, but look here at that smooth edge, very professional looking. And then even after cleaning it up with the file, this is pretty jagged and not real pretty here. And in fact, there's still even some metal stuck. So you can see the cleanup is a real chore with the step bits, whereas it is no problem at all when you use the punch. Then you can fit your tube socket either on top of the chassis and screw it down from above, or you'll have to make a slightly larger hole, about 1 1/8 inch, and you can go from underneath to install your tube sockets, your tube bases. As you can see, it fits naturally in both holes. This thing doesn't care who drilled the hole, just so it's the right size. Okay, so that's the end result. And it's kind of a matter of personal preference, I guess. If you want absolute perfection without a lot of noise and struggle, or if you want the step bit, which is going to lacerate the top of your chassis just a little bit, and maybe your forehead and Adam's apple. if you're not careful. So I leave it up to you. Okay, you can buy the step bits at places like Harbor Freight for like $15 or $20, or you can hunt down a set like this. Okay, the Greenlee set. Believe this or not, at a local garage sale, the whole thing plus the case for 40 bucks. Okay, so as you can see, and that's way less than any one of these punches cost. Okay, just one of them. So time to start scurrying around the neighborhood. Okay, and breaking in late at night, things like that. But the point is, if you like this method of punching holes, it's time to start hunting one down. Now, one thing I don't see in the instructions is any statement about what the maximum thickness of sheet metal is that these punches will work with. I'm going to guess probably up to around 16 gauge. I imagine it could cut through 16 gauge, but most amp chassis are probably, what, 18 or 20 gauge. So I can pretty well assure you that on the sheet metal used for any type of amplifier chassis, these punches are probably more than adequate. Also, I see here a heavy-duty radio chassis punch set here that's available, I guess, if you're going to go with a thicker metal. And if you're wondering if it'll work in aluminum, how about this for an extreme example? 1/8 inch thick and a perfect hole made with the punch. Okay? Pretty impressive. So I guess that's about it for this part 2 video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you then in our next video production, hopefully in the near future. Until then, bye for now.